Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Welsh. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We do appreciate it. We have a good one for you as always. Here is what is on the show. An interesting new piece today on this new website. Well, it's not really new, but it's kind of a national security for insiders by insiders website. By all accounts, pretty well-respected website. This kind of commentator, Jeremy Shapiro, breaking down why we are on the path to nuclear war. Pretty startlingly realistic scenario, and about the way things are now. So all the sides here are kind of in deeply entrenched positions, and that may lead to some serious problems. Also, in responsible statecraft, a very interesting and eyebrow-raising new critic of the United States policy in Ukraine, retired Admiral Mike Mullen, saying that we have to do everything we possibly can to try and get to the table with Vladimir Putin and trying to resolve this thing, saying he does not like the rhetoric at all that is coming out of this situation. Meanwhile, the Fed critics are saying that new CPI data is showing what a lot of people, we've been saying it for quite a long period of time. Recession is coming, and you can, raise as many rates as you want. All you're going to do is tighten up the labor market, which, to be fair, it was your intention. Anyway, finally on the show today, a pretty interesting story. We got activists acquitted in a trial from taking piglets from Smithfield Foods, one of the worst factory farmers out there. So that's on today's Newsflash. So that is a very, very interesting story. So they went to court. Smithfield sued these animal activists, and you can find out the details on that later on in the show. So this is kind of a really interesting. So we don't really often do this on the show, but I think this is a really good time. I really do try and kind of intersperse with a lot of the articles that we do on the show, but I think this is kind of one where I'm probably do a lot less of that, just kind of break down this point and to just kind of see what I think of it, trying to translate it for you here today and pretty much figure out what is going on. So he writes, Jeremy Shapiro, this War on the Rocks. So it's pretty much a kind of national security insider blog. In war, nothing is inevitable and not much is predictable. But the war in Ukraine has a direction that observers can see and that we should name. What began as a criminal Russian aggression against Ukraine has become a proxy war between Washington and Moscow. That is, pretty much everyone has said it at this point. We've obviously seen that claim from the Russian side, and we've now even, seen that claim, inadvertently from some kind of Democratic and Republican representatives who pretty much have had it slip out at this point that this is the West versus Russia yet again in the form of Ukraine. And, Ukraine would not survive on its own without help from the West, particularly, obviously, the United States. So there's two sides are locked into an escalatory cycle. We see that pretty clearly. One side escalating, the other side is escalating in response. Really directly. We saw that over the last week with that bridge strike that, I think any honest actor, can say pretty clearly the Ukrainians did that bridge strike, which was a big, you can say very fairly like the Russians should have had it come, like they should defend it better, whatever. But this is a big escalatory move. The Ukrainians, and this is why this is so problematic, because it gets really down. I said I could really go stick to the article here, but maybe not. But this is why this whole situation is so problematic, because we have so little control over what is going on, yet we are putting so much resource into this situation. So we have seen really just unprecedented amount of resources going into Ukraine at every level in terms of covert operations, all the way down to pretty much unprecedented amounts of arms sales in a really short amount of time. We haven't given them everything they wanted, but in turn, for pretty much, frankly, keeping their army and their country alive, it has been pretty clear that, they just want to do whatever they want. And, honestly, to be fair, looking at it from their perspective, it is a fair point. It is something that, they're trying to defend their own country. They want to do it in the way that they want to do it. But when it comes down to it, it really seems clear that we are not getting a lot out of this here. And really, frankly, by extension, the world and the people who want to see this war come to an end are not getting a lot out of this, because there is no way because this war has been allowed to escalate from point to point to point to point, and nothing's really been done about it. There's been no effort. The official U.S. policy at this point has been to continue to send arms to Ukraine. We have continued to just give them everything they want and really ask for very, very little in return. If we want to support Ukraine, that's one thing. But we, as a big supporters of Ukraine, should have say in what they do. And what they have been doing in turn is, really just launching these, counteroffensive. I think that is something the United States probably had a lot to do with. But they've also been doing these kind of covert operations, like the assassination in Moscow of what was supposed to be pretty much Vladimir Putin's Steve Bannon character, but they ended up getting his daughter instead. That was, it's pretty much confirmed now. I think the United States believes it. I think was the new news that they believe that they have confirmed the Russian side of things, that, and kind of admonished Ukraine in private not to do that again. But then all of a sudden this bridge situation comes out, where this major bridge, this symbol of Putin's reign, is blown up, and the United States has very little, it seems, advance warning of it. And what that does is lead to an intense amount of confrontation. Obviously, hostilities build. This bridge, as I said, pretty big symbol, important part of Putin's reign, and how he's viewed for the infrastructure projects that he's put out there, and especially the acquisition, shall we call it that, of Crimea, one way or the other. That was something that is another very, very big symbol of his reign, and it's just blown up. It's incredibly an embarrassing moment. And there's going to be some sort of requirement. There's going to be some sort of necessity to respond. And the United States, for what it's putting in, they have very little control over such an escalatory action from Ukraine. And what do we see there? Really, frankly, horrific shelling of Kiev in response that is, disproportionate, I would say, to just blowing up a bridge with, relatively minimal civilian casualties. But it is hard to imagine. That, this is the right or the smart step in terms of de-escalation, in terms of, taking the stakes down here for both sides, because both sides are going to be, especially Russia here, is going to view this as an existential conflict, because Russia is not backed up by, really the entire West in this situation. So they're feeling, especially as of late, increasingly desperate, increasingly under pressure. And when they're feeling increasingly under pressure, that is going to continue to lead them to, apparently, Putin has been watching the video of Muammar Gaddafi and how he was, sodomized in the street by pro-NATO forces or something like that after, or at least, indirectly because of NATO forces. He does not want that to happen to him, and he does not want to lose his power. And, that is a very, very strong motivation, especially if you're someone who's been so used to absolute power for so long, like Putin, to do pretty crazy and dangerous things. It's a very, very dangerous situation here, no doubt about it. So he writes, Shapiro, this is the two sides are locked in an escalatory cycle along current trends that will eventually bring them into direct conflict and then go nuclear, killing millions of people and destroying much of the world. And if we see serious nuclear conflict, that is going to destroy the world. That is going to functionally destroy the world as we know it today, make it unlivable for millions and billions of people. And if not, you just end it completely, depending on, of course, how bad the nuclear exchange is. This is obviously a bold prediction and certainly an unwise one to make, in part because if I'm right, unlikely to be around to take credit for it. President Joe Biden has named this danger to great criticism, apparently because he believes that Acknowledging the current danger increases the chances of avoiding such a terrible outcome. Indeed, much can change the current trajectory, but doing so will require purposeful action by both sides specifically intended to avoid direct confrontation. At the moment, neither side seems willing or politically able to take such steps. On the contrary, in Russia, nuclear threats are a prominent part of Russian war strategy. In the United States, commentators condemn those who even name this danger, fearing that doing so will weaken the Western resolve. And, this is, I think, a very, very apt point. And people from respect, people at places like MSNBC, respectable liberal outlets like the Atlantic, this is a nuclear folly, this nuclear bluff. Are you so sure? And this is like the United States' success of testing red lines has been, so far they've gotten away with it. But when it comes to literal nuclear Armageddon, how far do we want to push that line? And is there even going to be a public debate, for example, for that matter, on this issue? That, I think, is, another even more essential question that, frankly, the answer is probably going to be no. Commentators, they condemn those who even name this danger, fearing that doing so will weaken the Western resolve. Any mention of such considerations on Twitter, where it is always 1938, and it inevitably provokes accusations of appeasement and references to Neville Chamberlain. It's all these people, these, smart academics, experts in national security are, making this point, but this is something that is very, not always applicable. Instead, despite the opprobrium, not naming the danger is unlikely to reduce it. Think tank analysts prefer instead to talk in terms of scenarios, wherein we can bury the most likely outcome amongst a few other less likely possibilities. Such exercises are useful for planning purposes, and they appropriately reflect our general inability to predict events on the ground. But scenarios also serve to hide the relative likelihood of the various outcomes. Here I present the central scenario of nuclear escalation. I take as a starting point, so this is kind of a little thought experiment that he has here. He says, taking as a starting point, although we may experience long periods of relative stalemate and we may never arrive at such a horrific outcome, uncontrolled escalation is the path that we are currently on. I think that, that last part is an undeniable true statement. No rational or sane leader plans to start a nuclear war. And for all of the Russian regime's risk-taking, it does not show signs of suicidal tendencies. The essence of the problem is more insidious than mere insanity. Once an escalatory cycle begins, a series of individually rational steps can add up to a world-ending absurdity. So, steps that seem rational at the time will lead to something that is inevitably irrational, which I think is a very true and interesting and really, frankly, terrifying point when taken in this context. So, in Ukraine, both sides have publicly pledged that they cannot lose this war, and they hold that doing so would threaten their very way of life and values that they hold most dear. In the Russian case particularly, a loss to Ukraine would seem to threaten the regime's survival and even the territorial integrity of the country. That, I think, is a big deal. So if you're looking at, Ukraine, they're also dealing with the same thing. So the Russians have consistently responded to battlefield setbacks with their own escalations, including energy cutoffs to Europe, increased bombing of civilian targets, and recently through the formal annexation of 4 Ukrainian provinces and the partial mobilization of Russian manpower reserves. The last step carries obvious risks for the Russian regime, as the multiple protests against it across Russia testify, but the leadership preferred these domestic risks to losing the war. So they're really ready to take some pretty big risks in order to stave off, any kind of risk of defeat. Which they view is obviously a much bigger, greater risk. Of course, wars have often escalated, but no war since 1945 has ended in nuclear use. Nuclear powers have at times considered their use for warfighting, but have always stepped back from the brink. In the current situation, both sides have many more steps to take before direct confrontation. The United States has many more weapon systems to provide and many more ways to isolate the Russian economy. Russia has many more conscript, more brutal tactics to employ, and even more horrible weapons to deploy short of nuclear weapons. it is likely that if the war simply bogs down to war of attrition, that will not, be nuclear use. But if this path of uncontrolled escalation continues, it could get very dirty. Instead, escalation to nuclear weapons will require one side to feel that it is losing, and a military defeat will have catastrophic consequences for their regime, and just losing bad enough that a defeat is just kind of inevitable. And I think the personal safety of the leadership, if you're looking at especially Russia, is going to be much more of a factor there in terms of considerations. And to convince itself under the pressure of a looming military defeat that the nuclear use is the way out. So we have no precedent for these conditions being met in a nuclear-armed state, but it is not hard to imagine how they might be starting from where they are today. If the war continues to move against the Russians, and particularly if Ukrainians begin to invade Crimea, they will reach even greater levels of fear that the future of the Russian regime, currently as it is known today, is at stake. Some genius within the Russian leadership will put forward the idea they can reverse the momentum and demonstrate their greater willingness to accept Armageddon by a nuclear demonstration. As Michael Kaufman and Anya Lukinov-Fink have noted, the Russian military analysts have long believed in a demonstrative use of force and could subsequently include nuclear use for demonstration purposes, pretty much just, a flex of the muscles for no really other purpose than that, which is kind of deeply insane if you think about it. The West, this Russian optimist will argue, doesn't really care about Ukraine and will recoil at the real prospect of nuclear war, lacking better options or really any other options at all beyond surrender. Russian President Vladimir Putin or his successors will seize on this deus ex machina, such that in hopes of turning defeat into victory are the most effective enemies of peace. So as long as those hopes, as long as it seems to kind of go, much more dragged down and seems to be more costly for both sides, that seems to be much more of a kind of more optimistic way that a lot of people see peace happening. But, right now some of the most powerful people in our military are not very optimistic. Let's go to this. Retired general, former Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman, said on Saturday the United States needs to work on ending the war in Ukraine as soon as possible amid reports of escalating violence and talk of increased threats of nuclear weapons use. Retired Admiral Mike Mullen, the nation's top military officer during parts of the Bush and Obama administrations, assessed on ABC's This Week that Russian President Vladimir Putin is a cornered animal. A situation that he says speaks to the need to get to the table and negotiate. Corner animals can be very dangerous. So let's see if we can get a clip here of Mr. Mullen kind of talking about this. We'll work to get that. And it is kind of a very kind of surprising situation from and admission from someone who, this is someone that's kind of been said very much out of mainstream media, out of the kind of general Washington circles that, we're probably going to need to get to some sort of negotiation here, because that is how we're going to eventually end this war. So this is Mike Mullen, kind of relatively kind of moderate general, kind of but well respected within the Bush and Obama administrations here. This is what he has to say about the war. And of course, we are not getting that audio there. Just a minute. We'll get it right.
The nuclear threat from. Okay, let's turn to Ukraine. You heard President Biden's comments. You heard what John Kirby just said. How do you assess the nuclear threat from Russia right now?
Well, I have to take Putin seriously. He's got lots of options with tactical nuclear weapons from very low-yield nuclear weapons. He's I believe, a cornered animal, and I think he's more and more dangerous. Just what's happened in the last 24 hours. That bridge was struck, which was logistically critical as well as very symbolic. So I think we have to take him seriously and think through what the requirements would be for us to respond to that. It also speaks to the need, I think, to get to the table. I'm a little concerned about the language, which we're about at the top, if you will.
President Biden's language.
President Biden's language, we're about at the top of the language scale, if you will. And I think we need to back off that a little bit and do everything we possibly can to try to get to the table to resolve this thing.
Yeah, so that is actually quite clear and a pretty kind of off the standard statement from somebody like Mike Mullen, which you do not see every day. Why should Mike Mullen, America's highest-ranking general under two presidents, ask Biden to work towards Ukraine talks? Is it because he doesn't understand geopolitics, like Elon Musk apparently didn't, or is it because he's on Putin's payroll or his stooge? Well, probably not. The thing is, this is just kind of the reality that a lot of people. I don't really know what the situation obviously is in Washington, but it seems clear that if we continue on this path of just kind of letting Ukraine escalate and sending them weapons and not really having control over whether and what way and how they escalate and really not monitoring it in a very close way at all. And just saying, we have to set some red lines to how far we'll go and actually make steps to try and push towards some sort of negotiation. That seems very, very hard at this point, to be very fair. That's just going to be what is going to have to happen there. All right. That is our kind of Ukraine section. We'll talk about inflation. It's not getting any better. That's next. My name is Spencer Walsh. This is the Spencer Walsh Radio Network, and if you're listening to one of our podcasts, whether it's Newsflash, Hidden History, The Spencer Walsh Show, or something else, ladies and gentlemen, we have one simple request of you. Please be sure to rate us, subscribe to us if you like us, and leave us a comment, because just like all of you, sometimes we need that feedback in our lives, good or bad. We want to hear what you have to say. So please do those steps. Make SWR and content better. And thank you so much for listening. You're listening to Newsflash on SWRN. As we get back into the swing of things with our schedule, let's talk about, inflation, unfortunately, getting back into the upward swing of things. As data released on Thursday shows inflation kept climbing in September, even after U.S. Federal Reserve Bank has raised interest rates, I think, 3 times by 0.75%. Progressives have reiterated the nation's central bank is ill-equipped to tackle the root causes of rising prices and urged Congress to rein in corporate greed before further rate hikes throw millions of people out of work and help crash the global economy. Because, the Fed thinks that they got, I think, purpose. I think, in my opinion, we've been kind of seeing this telegraphed for, frankly, months. This is a bit more of a malicious situation. This is people who have control over the global economy. They want to see a recession. They want to see a tight labor market. They want to see things go back to normal. And this is in all various sectors for various different reasons. But generally, a biggest thing is to make the labor options for a lot of workers in the service industries, kind of more low-paying industries who work for these big employers, much less competitive. So they can't just forced to jack up their wages to $15 an hour plus. That's just horrific, absolutely horrific stuff. Can you believe it? It is just absolutely just so inhumane that any Chipotle, poor Chipotle owner would ever have to do that for their workers. But no, it has to be the fact that, we have to raise interest rates. We need to screw with the whole economy, particularly with most vulnerable people, the people who are in the most insecure work, raise that unemployment rate, and just kind of continue to make it worse. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the overall consumer price index rose 0.4% last month and is up 8.2% from a year earlier. This monthly increase was driven by soaring rent, grocery, and healthcare prices, which was actually pretty interesting. I think the food situation is kind of separate from, rent and healthcare prices. Those are two industries which are just completely one-sided industries, where the people, the consumer, just has, the everyday average person just has no representation whatsoever, and it's just subject to a market that is just becoming just completely out of control in the rental market. In the especially as COVID, as the regulations continue to ease up on eviction moratoriums and things like that, evictions are going to continue to go up. It's going to, get people into out of homes, jack up those prices. Home prices also going up, as well. Healthcare prices also, which is that's kind of a price of its own, a situation of its own, just industries that have just completely escaped the reach of the government. So the annual change has been fueled largely in historic spikes in the cost of food and energy, which critics attribute to the price gouging and destabilizing effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Core CPI, which excludes food and energy, increased 0.6% for a second consecutive month, and is up 6.6% with last year, reaching its highest level since 1982. Today's report is proof of what we've been saying for months. Raising interest rates isn't working. How many more 0.75 basis points raises do we need to see this? Says Rakeen Mahmood, chief economist at the Groundwork Collective. Supply chain bottlenecks of volatile global energy market and rampant corporate profiteering can't be solved by additional rate hikes. The Fed's overly aggressive actions, again, completely undemocratic as well, are bring our economy to the brink of a devastating recession. Corporate profits are also at record levels. Meanwhile, Sarah Barron, campaign director for advocacy group Unrig Our Economy, detailed in a Wednesday column at Other Words, companies are boosting their profits to keeping prices by keeping prices artificially high. So General Mills hiked its prices 5 times since June of 2021, and the company saw its net earnings climb 31% to $820 million. Think about all the food. Go look it up. Go look up all the stuff that General Mills owns, and the fact. Think about how many millions of Americans eat those products. I know I do. And the company saw its net earnings climb to 31% to $820 million in the first quarter of the 2023 fiscal year. Darden Restaurants, the company which owns popular chains such as Olive Garden and Longhorn Steakhouse, saw its net sales increase by $140 million to over $2.4 billion in the first quarter of fiscal year 2023. As AutoZone saw record sales growth over the past 2 years, their CEO has admitted the company is not racing to lower prices anytime soon. Instead, they boosted their shareholder handouts, and guess what? Those 2 words, they're coming very soon. $1 billion they spent on stock buybacks during the quarter, bringing their total to $4.4 billion during fiscal year 2022. During Monday's meeting of the National Association for Business Economics, Fed Vice Chair Lil Brainerd acknowledged that the large increases in retail trade margins in several sectors is a significant factor behind surging prices. Pretty much what that means is they're making so much more money off of the individual sales, and the margin between that and the prices is skyrocketing. And, I don't even know if the Biden administration could even do anything about it, frankly, if they wanted to, because nevertheless, Fed Chair Jerome Powell has indicated that while these companies are going to continue to raise prices with the free reign of the government, just looking on and, unable to do anything about it. As that happens, we are going to see Jerome Powell continue to drive up unemployment and create another economic recession. So that is all very well and good. Let's go to our last story. This is a crazy story, and it's also kind of a bit of good news as well. In an historic trial over the 2017 removal of 2 sick and dying piglets from Utah's Smithfield Foods factory farm, 2 animal rights activists were acquitted by a jury Saturday night on burglary and theft charges, which could have sent them to prison for 5.5 years each. Intercept reporting on this. The verdict is a culmination of more than 5-year pursuit that multiple agencies, including the FBI and the Utah Attorney General's office, began after the activists published undercover footage revealing the gruesome conditions at Smithfield, the nation's largest pork producer. So Wayne Haisung, I don't know if you're saying that right, Wayne Sayung, I'm not sure, and Paul Picklesheimer, the members of the animal rights group Direct Action Everywhere, or DXE, removed the 2 sick, severely underweight pigs from Smithfield in March 2017. So this is pretty much what you're seeing. It's a really cool, actually, I think really cool story, and just cool and outrageous at the same time. One of those stories that just people are amazing, but also, we are living in an evil, evil world. If something like this can happen, because this centers around the really awful practice that farm animals or factory farms do with pigs, because in order to get the most meat per square foot of farm ground, they just stack all the pigs up in one little area, pretty much where for their whole life they cannot move, they cannot turn around, and they just sit there, from pretty much. In this farm, they pledged not to do it, but these they pledged that they were getting rid of the gestation crates, but these animal activists have pretty much snuck in and just saw a pretty much animal wasteland, a waste zone. It was absolutely awful. Just carcasses of pigs littered everywhere, and of course the gestation crates were still going on. They just completely lied to everyone, and the pigs were like, I guess, not at that current location, but there were just 2 pigs left behind, I think, among what just really turned out to, and they were filming all of this. It is really just crazy stuff. So they see these 2 piglets, they nickname them Lily and Lizzie. They removed the piglets from the Smithfield farm in March of 2017, and they brought them to receive veterinary care, and took them to a sanctuary for rescued farm animals in Colorado. Later that year, as the Intercept reported, the FBI chased the piglets across state lines and raided the sanctuary where they were living, bringing them with them veterinarians who sliced off a piece of Lizzie's ear to perform a DNA test and confirm she was the property of Smithfield Foods. Of course, the animals were not removed from the sanctuary and still live there to this day. So those pigs are safe, but obviously so many other pigs go through this awful experience. But it's like if stories like this became much more public and well known and just accepted as part of the culture, I mean, I think it would go a long way towards people realizing just how insidious these facts. Like, they don't care about anybody. They don't care about you. They don't care about the pigs. They don't, they just care about making money. No surprise there. That's all the time I got for today. Thank you so much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. This has been Newsflash. We will see you next Tuesday on the Spencer Walsh Radio Network.